anything that's coded as normal is kind of bad and is revolted against. And so that is how we get anti-Zionists who call themselves queer, who may be gay or lesbian, but are not necessarily gay or lesbian. And in fact, there were plenty of gays and lesbians at the time and even now who said, like, this doesn't actually account for, like, I have actual real issues that are related to my sexual identity that queer is not speaking to.
Hello, hello. I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. We are really very evasive about the Jewishness of this podcast. That's really the aim here. So sometimes you read a novel and it's like you're reading your own thoughts or what they would be if you were able to express them so artfully. It's rare to have that kind of experience with a novel, but even more so with nonfiction. Yet this was my experience reading Jesella's book, Feminist Anti-Semitism, An Intellectual History, which is coming out on June 24th. It was this book where I'm reading it and I'm highlighting basically all of it and trying to find like, oh no, that's the key passage. No, that is, nodding along and feeling like surely somebody has had this thought before, but no, this is new. I am so pleased that Kara is here to discuss this. So Kara, welcome to The Jewish Angle.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. And, you know, the book's just about to come out, so not that many people have read it yet. So I'm so pleased to hear that it made an impression on you.
It did. It absolutely did. So my first question is kind of like it's a two-part question that has to do with the intonation. So I want to know how you came to write this book, but I also want to know how you came to write this book.
So I was extremely lucky in that when I went to college, which was back in the 90s, my very first women's studies professor happened to be the college rabbi. So she brought in all this amazing Jewish feminist writing that I loved and that I had had in my head for all the decades after college when I was a feminist journalist. I wrote a book. And when I went back to get my PhD, I was still thinking about it. And towards the end of the time that I was working on my PhD, so this is about 2021, there's a conflict between Hamas and Israel. And I saw that all of my feminist friends were posting these absolutely horrific things about Israel, horrific things about Jews. And I kept thinking, I don't really understand how we got to this moment. And, you know, I had read some feminist anti-Zionist work while I was getting my PhD. It didn't make a huge impression on me. I don't remember people really talking about it in terms of Israel. They were talking actually about the theories instead. And so I decided to go back and try to figure out what was going on. And it was just sort of supposed to be a side project. And at some point I realized there is a whole book here, and that what had happened was that this animosity towards Jewish women, which had been expressed at the beginning of the feminist movement, which is kind of shocking. Most people would think there's so many Jewish women, how could that be true? That it then became like codified into all of these different feminist theories, and the feminist theories changed greatly over the years. So by the time October 7th happened, I had actually written a large part of the book. And unfortunately, October 7th just showed how much of a need there was for the book, and that the things that I had been thinking about, many more people could see were actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I will be addressing many of the things you just said in many of the questions, but I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your professional trajectory because it's so unusual. And as a longtime New York Times style section reader, of interest to me for that entirely selfish reason. But specifically for our listeners, you co-wrote with Melissa Meltzer, who I've also reviewed her work. She's really good. A book about Sassy. And that was a teen girl magazine in the 80s and 90s. Now, I wanted to ask specifically about that. In like, how did Sassy, because I only vaguely remember Sassy. Did it, how did it compare to Teen Vogue in terms of being political?
So this is the exact right question to ask me because I was actually an editor at Teen Vogue while I was writing my sassy book. So I have lots to say about that. So Sassy was so different from other teen magazines of the late 80s and early 90s because it was so overtly political and feminist. And, it still talked about fashion and boys and those kinds of things. And so an adult would maybe look at it and not understand how subversive it was. But it was doing all kinds of very forthcoming stories about, gender and sex and sexuality and all kinds of things way before a magazine like Teen Vogue did. So when I was at Teen Vogue, at a very sort of pre-woke moment.
Right. So that was what I was going to ask, because I was thinking of like more specifically, even for this podcast, like my sense of Teen Vogue and where it would fall on the spectrum of things feminist, anti-Semitism, my guess, I have not combed Teen Vogue archives, would be that it would be fairly omnicausal.
I mean, I think absolutely. So when I was there in the early 2000s, I was by far I don't know if we say most woke or wokest editor. And I remember trying to like get intersectionality in there I did a story that was like how different ethnic and racial groups had different ideas about beauty and different beauty standards. And I would have never used the word intersectionality. Like a handful of us in the world even knew what that word meant at that point. So, it was after I left, and I mean, it has actually been quite shocking to me to see that Teen Vogue became way more radical, actually, than Sassy ever was, publishing stories by people that were very explicitly against Israel, explicitly talking about intersectionality, but I think saying things about white girls or white women that are quite radical. I mean, when I was there, I think there was a pretty big, the idea that you were supposed to be supportive of all girls or all women was still pretty operative. And I don't think that is there so much anymore.
Yeah, it's so many different, women's media, teen girl media, that's itself, I could keep going, but I have to ask you about feminist anti-Semitism as well. So what comes through very well in your book is just that a lot of the things that one sees these days, and we will get to them, come from this very specific environment of academic feminism and feminist activism. And it's one where it seems like Black women and Jewish women were particularly present, influential, active, whatever you want to say, and where the white women often were Jewish women. Not always, whatever. And it's not that type of book with like spreadsheets or whatever, for the best perhaps. But how did that come to be? Like, that was a question I had kind of in the back of my mind when reading, like, why these two groups of women?
I think that, there were so many Jewish women who were involved in early leftist and civil rights activism. And so it was a lot of those women who actually started the feminist movement. And even Betty Friedan, who is now made out to be, this like liberal, reformist, racist kind of person. I would, and I do in the book push back against that. She was actually quite radical. She had worked in labor journalism. And so she had regularly written about problems of Black and Latina women and also of discrimination against Jews. So part of it was that's part of how they had this experience already. So that's part of how they were able to become leaders in their own movement. And for Black women, they really did come together to create some of the most sophisticated early theory pushing back on the kind of writing that Friedan was doing and that other Jewish feminists did, saying that, we can't just think about gender. We also need to think about race. We need to think about class. And they were very influenced by Black power. So they were sort of saying that Black power was saying Black is beautiful, but that women needed to be subservient to men. And the feminist movement was saying, women are all equal and we're all sisters because of gender. And so they were the earliest ones to come together as a group. And there too, a lot of them had experience in the civil rights movement. There was the Black arts movement as well. So I think it was easy for them to come together to circulate their work. And it did quickly become a thing where it was these two groups who started to be pitted against one another, or to pit themselves against one another.
The sort of the saddest part of this is the way, as you write, Jewish feminists kind of wrote the script for their own, not just irrelevance, but like it became the Jewish women were the enemy, and how Jewish feminists themselves, and I should say this as a Jewish feminist, I am a Jewish feminist, so I feel like I have a stake in this as well. Just sort of, you write about this, the way they didn't emphasize, they wanted to be universalist and not particularist, and they also were very comfortable standing against the majority of Jews, and that this made them different from other women who were in feminism and members of minority groups. So, and they also just seem to want to like this very noble idea of putting others first also can kind of segue into an anti-feminist idea of not taking up too much space. Like it's fascinating. I feel like I'm not doing this justice as I explain it, but
no, I think you're absolutely right. Some of the earliest feminists, they didn't really want to talk about how they were Jewish because they wanted to be seen as internationalists and they wanted to be seen as people who cared about everyone. But once identity feminism really kicked into gear, which was like, it started in the 70s and then became a really big thing in the 80s, a lot of feminists, of other, women of color would say like, well, you never even talked about being Jewish before. And now all of a sudden you want in on this identity feminism. And it's just because, you think this is the way to get attention. And so you're actually drowning out our voices. And so this idea that Jewish women had, which was like, we want to bring women together globally across all these differences, it ended up getting recast as racist. The idea that like, they couldn't see the differences that other women had and that they were suddenly trying to get in on this identity feminism, whereas they hadn't talked about being Jewish before.
Right. I mean, there is just something sort of frustrating about all of this when you think about it, because I think one hears about like Jews having decided to become white, which I think is extremely, well, oversimplifying and often just sort of it's not quite this. And I think a lot of the time, so I'm going to jump ahead to a totally later question that's been kind of on my mind. Something that you write about that's been very much in the news lately is the Bund, right? The Bund. I don't know German, sorry. Bund, yeah. as
I'm always worried about mispronouncing.
French, I'm all right. It's the German that gets trickier. But there is something where it seems like a certain sort of, you talk about as a Jew, as a phenomenon, and I feel like listeners may know what you mean, but I will still ask you to kind of explain it, but how Jews of this sort of inclination talk about whiteness is so interesting because it's both this kind of like confession of white privilege and also kind of like trying to step up, but being like not like the others, not like the ones who are enjoying their white privilege, but also talking about themselves as like, I'm thinking of like, and I like him in many ways, but Bernie Sanders saying like, calling himself of Polish extraction, and this big sort of emphasis these days, especially of saying, no, I have nothing to do with Israel. My ancestry is, the Yiddish civilization. Of course, how did it come to be written in that script? They may find themselves wondering. But anyway, I'm rambling. Stop my rambling, please.
You're not rambling at all. So this idea, we hear it all the time now. Somebody says, as a Jew, and it's usually going to be followed by something that is, hurtful or derogatory to most Jewish people. So, but the idea is that the speaker can say it because they themselves are Jewish. And this sort of identity, this sort of idea that there are these anti-Zionists, which they often are, who are saying negative things about Jews, that they can say it or should say it as Jews, really does come out of feminism. And part of the reason that the feminist movement was able to sort of incubate this theory or this identity is because that was part of women's studies. So if you've ever been in a women's studies class, you know that you immediately are supposed to say every little part of your identity. So we were talking about Black feminism before. A lot of this came out of Black feminism and the idea that you're not just a woman, you also have a race and a class and a sexual preference and all kinds of other things. So as a Jew sort of evolves out of that. And the neo-Bundist thing is so interesting because there's this moment in the 2000s where Jews are really being pushed out of feminist spaces, 1990s and 2000s. They're being pushed out of feminist spaces and they kind of need a way back in. And the only way to do that at that moment was to sort of emphasize your own identity. But they want to emphasize a Jewish identity that's not the Jewish identity that most people think of, which means, Zionist, connected to Israel in some way. And so a way to do that was to talk about the Bund and talk about, an internationalist, anti-racist, anti-Zionist group that they wanted to look back to and say, like, this is who we claim as our ancestors.
Well, it's fascinating that part of your book I found really interesting about the sort of rejecting all ways of being Jewish. It wasn't just like not make it about Israel, not make it about the Holocaust. It was also not make it about peoplehood, not make it about religion, because that's too patriarchal. And maybe even not make it about like bagels and Seinfeld, because that's too shallow. You know what I mean? Like it seems like this kind of, there's the negative, but there's also, it did seem like this weird way of paradoxically reifying the idea of Jews as just sort of any other European group, right?
Absolutely. And what's so confounding about that is that, at the same time, they're trying to say, we really care about people of color. That's part of what was behind this. But in the way that they did this, they're erasing all of the people of color that are Jewish that live in Israel, many of whom really need to live in Israel. They were kicked out of their countries or treated terribly in other countries, and Israel is where they live now. We know that, there's many Jews of color in Israel. So it's like maybe the way this new identity that they were creating was good for some Jews who live in America, but it was actually really harmful, I think, to a lot of Israeli Jews.
Well, I want to kind of expand on that and tease that out a little bit, because this is something I've been thinking about ever since. So there's a story from pop culture, sort of, that I'm sure you're familiar with, and is kind of at the intersection of your various beats over the years. Man Repeller, Leandra Medine Cohen. She, for those who listen to this podcast, you probably already know, because I mention this often, she was this very popular fashion and style blogger starting in 2010. She was a big deal. Then she had a 2020 girl boss downfall, like so many, and was sort of held up as the example of white privilege. Now, she is of full Mizrahi ancestry. Like, both of her parents are Mizrahi. She's Jewish, absolutely. She could, if she had different political inclinations, aesthetics, whatever, be calling herself a Jew of color and being on, like lists of like celebrating the Jews of color. But she's not, because she's a fashion blogger, right? And a smart one. Like, I like her. I don't know her personally, but I like her work. But there's something that's happened, I think, where it's not that somebody like that, or an Israeli Jew who might be not merely Mizrahi but Black, is still white by these definitions of whiteness that are so hazy that anybody can kind of be anything. So I've been thinking about that, and also how, and this is going on for a while, but for a reason, you write about sort of how queer theory enters into all of this. And there is this thing with these sort of unstable categories. and like be sort of like the confusion is almost the point.
Right. And so like part of this is that she becomes this figure coded white, though she is not. Because we do move into this moment of sort of non-identity identity, where queer becomes the identity, but it's about not having an identity. And it's actually associated with a certain way of being in the world. So it's about being, one famous queer theorist said that it was about revolting against regimes of the normal. And so part of what makes this relevant for anti-Semitism is Israel was coded as normal. Like Israel was what America at that time was supporting. So America was coded as normal. So anything that's coded as normal is kind of bad and is revolted against. And so that is how we get anti-Zionists who call themselves queer, who may be gay or lesbian, but are not necessarily gay or lesbian. And in fact, there were plenty of gays and lesbians at the time and even now who said, like, this doesn't actually account for, like, I have actual real issues that are related to my sexual identity that queer is not speaking to. So
yes, I want to unpack that as well. Would you believe it? So I did genuinely see on a t-shirt in Toronto, and that's what prompted me to write about this, not gay as in happy, but queer as in free Palestine. And you mentioned this slogan in your book. So obviously we're going to talk about this. And a quote from your book that one of the many I highlighted, many who called themselves queer were gay and lesbian, but some were not. They opposed society itself, end quote. And this is something that, I've been thinking about a lot. Just, this is kind of like, I guess, where our work somewhat converges, but just this way of when women's studies became gender studies, it's not that women were like fully erased and it suddenly became a men's rights movement, but there did sort of stop being a way for like advocating for women as such. And it's just interesting how I'm just thinking of how all these things align. Like you sort of need some chart or something, like one of those conspiracy theory things. But like, I don't know. What do you make of that expression, like, or that slogan, not gay as in happy, but queer as in free Palestine? Explain it to somebody who does not immediately sort of understand what that could possibly mean.
Let's see if I can do this. I tried to do this actually on the street with a mom friend once. I'm not sure if I achieved my goal or not. I mean, part of the project of queer theory is to redefine things. And so that's part of what you see when you see that shirt, that move from like gay to queer and sort of, queer was historically a negative label that was applied to gay people that they reclaimed. And so part of it is about reclaiming that word and then, making it about a totally different thing. And also, I think, trying to show that it's about this revolt against regimes of the normal. And it's also supposed to be a little bit confusing. Like part of queerness, and I am not the first person to say this, I got part of this idea from the queer scholar Heather Love. And she talks about how part of the idea is being hip to what queer is about. So if you don't get it, you don't get it. And that means like you're not a part of this. And so those people who see it and just get it because they're a little bit fluent in queer theory, it's a way, that t-shirt is a way of creating a subculture, which is very much what has happened with anti-Zionism. And part of that had to do with, gays and lesbians were getting increasing rights, 90s, 2000s. And there were plenty of gays and lesbians who did not want to lead normal lives, quote unquote, normal lives. Like they didn't want to be in the military. They were not interested in getting married. And so they still wanted to be part of the subculture that they had spent all of these years building. And so Palestine has given them something to rally around that keeps them together and that keeps them doing this sort of work that's against normalcy. And as we know, it is no longer at all just gays and lesbians. It's many, many,
Right.
many.
I mean, it's the unstable categories thing interests me so much, specifically just this idea that once you make the categories like that, you make it possible for you not only exclude a lot of gay, lesbian, and even trans people from this umbrella because they're too normy or whatever, but you also include, and this is where my own research area is kind of making it sound more highfalutin than it is, but my own interest comes into it, is you get a lot of people who are functionally straight, who appear to be straight, who only have opposite sex partners, who look gender conforming of whatever they were assigned at birth, but they're queer because ... question mark. You know what I mean? Like they're queer because of a vibe or something. And I'm not entirely convinced that this is as progressive as it claims to be, but that's just me, maybe.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, and I think we're seeing so many negative things about it now. And I think one of the negative things is that this is really distracting from real problems that gays and lesbians have. It's distracting from real problems that women have. I mean, you know, there's so many things now that seem so much more tenuous. I mean, in America, it's like the right to abortion that has changed so much. And it's really, to me, it's really changed on the watch of these anti-Zionist feminists whose concerns have become so important to the movement that, and, thinking about Israel is so much more important to them than thinking about the right to abortion or then advocating for it or even then voting for somebody who is more likely to protect it. So I think these ideas, this like non-identity identity, this vibe is actually really negative and doing things to people that supposedly the movement is supposed to be trying to protect and advocate for.
It's interesting, right? Because it's Palestine in this kind of sense that's unhinged, sort of, it's, what's the word? Sort of disconnected from anything to do with actual Palestinians. You know what I mean? Like it is this kind of notion of, but there's something you wrote that really clarified for me something that I've been working on myself, which is, I'm quoting from your book, that the oppressed can see their own position, the position of the oppressor, and even the shape of the social system as a whole with the greatest clarity. End quote. Like that, this is the idea, right? It's not you are not expressing. This is the idea that you're discussing. It's always hard in podcasts. I feel like one gets the people angry thinking. Anyway, this is something I've come up against a lot with straightness, where there's a ton of work on straightness, but it's virtually all from people who are not straight themselves, but claim that straight people cannot talk about straightness because they're straight and that they understand it better than a straight person could. And then there's always this very obvious blind spot of, but what if you're actually attracted to the opposite sex? And that's sort of like weirdly missing from a lot of this work. But there's something I need to ask you about, though, which is another quote from your book. Okay. So here goes. Feminist whiteness studies scholars would also authorize the cruelty towards women that feminism initially had taken away, characterizing it not as misogyny, but as virtuousness, so long as the women being targeted were white, end quote. I've thought a lot about this, as would shock anybody. But this really has made its way through the culture with left-wing and then right-wing men sort of embracing it. I don't know if you're familiar with that acronym AWFL.
I feel like I should say yes, but no.
It's something after now I want to make sure that I say it correctly what it means, because it's affluent white liberal or affluent white female liberal or something like this. Yes, affluent white female liberal. It sounds like awful, right? So this is sort of the right wing version of the bad white lady, where it can be a white man who's saying this, but he's mad at the white woman for being liberal. Obviously, we've talked about girl boss downfalls, which often would end with men in charge of the company, whatever. But I really want to talk about this thing with the Karen, because I feel like the Karen Is Karen Jewish?
Karen is Jewish. Karen is absolutely Jewish. Um, yes, I think that the qualities that we attribute to Karen are often the same qualities that are stereotypically Jewish. So, pushy would be the biggest one. And then Jews have already, by the time Karen became um, a word that we all used, the idea that Jews were racist was already in the culture. So the idea of Karen is also that she's racist.
Right. And the idea that Jews are like specifically racist, not because I think like it's hard to have these conversations without doing I don't do hand wringing. I don't like to do hand wringing, but like for the particularly requiring of hand wringing, of course, Jews can be racist. Of course, like we could do the whole thing. Of course, Israel has done things that are worthy of criticism. Of course, we could wring our hands all day. The question is like, do Jewish women embody all the evil qualities of white men? You know what I mean? Like, are Jewish women the worst of white men? And that seems to be weirdly where feminism, a movement with many Jewish women founders, has landed. And that's just what's so odd, right?
It's so odd. And my theory about that, at least partially, is that so if you read the Jewish women who came up with these ideas in whiteness studies, often they will say, oh, there's really an outsized number of Jewish women doing this anti-racist work. And so I think part of what happened is that if a Jewish woman had like one, a grandmother who said one thing once, like used a Yiddish word that is not nice for Black people, like one time, that would become the basis for these theories that, everyone was doing it. And it made it seem that it was very contemporary as opposed to something that was kind of old world and was actually on its way out. And I think because there were so many of them, they got this idea that they were somehow worse. But actually, they were the ones doing anti-racist work, I think, because they actually cared about not being racist more than most white people. So it became, I think, all turned around in a way that people are still relying on these theories that have been, they came out of a very certain milieu that's not very representative.
Yeah. I think it does seem like it has arrived at a place, and I am not the first to have had these thoughts where it's not just thought like, oh, Jews can be white, Jews can look pale, sure, all of this. But like when in certain milieus, in certain contexts, somebody says white people, they kind of mean Jews. And that's what's so strange. And they even mean Jews who are not white.
Absolutely.
It's so weird.
It's so weird. And a lot of that I do think has to go with going back to Betty Friedan just so early on, like in the early 60s, certainly by 1970 had become the representative of quote unquote white feminism. And she was just so obviously Jewish. Like she has a Jewish last name. Often articles would talk about how she had a big nose. So all of these ways of characterizing her were both Jewish and then as sort of the ultimate white.
Yeah. It's amazing how early all of that started. I have a million questions, but I'm going to have to stop because I have one more that I want to be sure. Okay. So obviously the book's not out yet, but what has the reception been either of the imminence of your book or just you've been working on this for some time and have published things that sort of lead up to it? What has the reception been to your work on feminist anti-Semitism?
So I would say initially it was silence, like not complete silence, but a lot of the people who say follow me on Instagram are people that I know from my feminist grad school days, and many of them who I was once really close with, I finally had to unfollow at some point after October 7th because their posts about Jews were just too much. And of course I could see that when I would post like, oh, here's my article in Quillette or wherever else, that they would see it. but I didn't hear a word. So I kind of didn't know if I would get something negative, but instead it was just like, let's not engage with this at all. And then I guess the flip side of that is I've also come into some contact with people who have reached out to me and said, like, I've been waiting for somebody to do this, or I didn't understand this before. So like the historian Jeffrey Herf was one of the first people who got in touch with me after I wrote about it in Quillette. And then I actually pretty recently was at a Harvard conference on anti-Semitism and sexual violence. And so that was interesting too. You don't know what you're making up and what is real sometimes. And so, there were many women at the conference who I felt were really friendly to me leading up to the conference. Then after I spoke and said some really hard things, some of them I thought, they don't seem as interested in talking to me anymore. But am I making that up? I'm not sure. So there's been a lot of that kind of thing. And, I really only started using X a few months ago. I realized I'd better do it. It was time. There, I think I've actually gotten a really good response. People seem interested and are starting to say smart things. I think that a lot of people care right now about the relationship between Blacks and Jews. And so I think my book has a lot to say about that, because I think a lot of where that relationship has gone actually has to do with Black women and Jewish women. It's not just Blacks and Jews in general. And I think there's been so much attention to anti-Zionist Jews. And so I think people are starting to understand a little bit that came out of feminism and that identity was incubated in feminism. So I think people are starting to be interested in that as well. But it will be interesting to see where all that goes once it's actually out.
Cara, Jesella, thank you so much for coming on The Jewish Angle. This has been great.
Thank you so much for having me.